Picture a hospital operating room in Moscow, January 1966. A 60-year-old man lies on the table for what was described to him as a routine procedure, removing a polyp, a minor surgery that should have taken an hour or two. The surgeon assigned to the case wasn't a specialist in this specific operation. He was a senior health official, present partly for political reasons. Partway through, the surgical team discovers a second, much larger tumor nobody had detected beforehand. The operation stretches on. Complications follow. By the end of the day, the man is dead. For most of the world, his name meant nothing at the time, because almost nobody outside a small circle in the Soviet government was allowed to know it. He'd spent his entire career known publicly only as the chief designer, his identity classified for years to protect him from assassination or defection pressure during the height of the Cold War. His actual name was Sergei Korolev, and he was the single most important architect behind nearly every major Soviet space achievement of the era. Sputnik, the first satellite; Vostok, the spacecraft that carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit as the first human in space. A string of firsts that had, up to that exact point, kept the Soviet Union ahead of the United States in nearly every major milestone of the space race. His path to that position was almost as improbable as the achievements themselves. In the late 1930s, during Stalin's purges, Korolev was arrested on fabricated charges of sabotage and sent to a labor camp in Siberia, where he lost most of his teeth to scurvy and nearly died from the conditions before being transferred to a special prison workshop where engineers and scientists were put to work designing aircraft and weapons for the state that had imprisoned them. He was eventually released and rehabilitated, and within roughly 2 decades, went from a starving prisoner in a Siberian camp to the single most powerful engineer in the entire Soviet space program. Losing him to a preventable surgical complication after surviving all of that adds a particular weight to how arbitrary his death actually was. Here's what actually happened after he died. Korolev had been personally overseeing development of the N-1, an enormous rocket intended to send Soviet cosmonauts to the moon, and by most accounts, he was one of the only people in the entire Soviet space program with the technical authority and political skill to hold together the competing design bureaus, rival engineers, and bureaucratic infighting that plagued the project. Without him, leadership of the N-1 program fell to Vasily Mishin, a capable engineer who lacked Korolev's political standing and ability to navigate Soviet bureaucracy at the highest levels. The N-1 rocket went on to fail in spectacular fashion 4 separate times between 1969 and 1972. One of those failures produced one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history when the rocket collapsed back onto its launch pad shortly after liftoff, an explosion powerful enough to be detected by seismographs and to level a substantial portion of the launch facility. Investigators traced many of the failures back to problems with the rocket's 30 first-stage engines, an unusually high number for a single rocket, coordinated by a control system that struggled to manage that many engines firing in unison without something eventually going wrong. Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut who had already been selected to command the eventual lunar landing mission, never got the chance to fly it. The program was quietly canceled in 1974, and the Soviet Union never landed a human being on the moon. Meanwhile, the United States, driven by President Kennedy's public commitment to reach the moon before the decade was out, successfully landed Apollo 11 in July 1969, with Neil Armstrong becoming the first human to walk on the lunar surface. An estimated worldwide television audience in the hundreds of millions watched the grainy black and white footage live, making it one of the most widely witnessed events in human history up to that point. It became one of the defining moments of the entire 20th century, and one of the most lasting symbols of American technological achievement during the Cold War, a symbol made even more powerful by the fact that, for years beforehand, It had genuinely looked like the Soviets might get there first. So that's what happened. Now, otherwise. Picture that same operating table, except this time, the surgery goes as expected. Maybe a more experienced specialist is assigned to the case instead of a political appointee. Maybe the second tumor is caught in an earlier screening. Maybe complications simply don't set in the way they did, and Korolev walks out of that hospital and back into work within a matter of weeks, the same way any successful routine surgery would allow. With Korolev still alive and still running the N1 program, the picture changes substantially. He'd already proven repeatedly an ability to force feuding design bureaus to cooperate, to secure funding through sheer personal political capital, and to push through engineering setbacks that would have stalled a less politically connected leader. He had personally outmaneuvered rival chief designers with different visions for the Soviet space program throughout his career, using his direct relationships with Soviet leadership to secure priority for his own projects. That kind of political skill mattered just as much as engineering talent in a system where multiple competing bureaus were often working on overlapping or contradictory approaches to the same problem, each backed by different officials with their own agendas. Whether the N1's specific technical problems, engine reliability issues that plagued all 4 historical test failures, get fully solved under his continued leadership is impossible to know for certain. But most historians studying the Soviet space program agree that Korolev, surviving into the late 1960s, meaningfully improves the odds of the one eventually succeeding, simply because so much of the program's later dysfunction stemmed directly from the leadership vacuum his death created. Mishin, his successor, was widely respected as an engineer, but lacked the same standing to force resolution when rival bureaus disagreed on fundamental design choices, and several of those unresolved disagreements are cited by historians as contributing directly to the specific failures that doomed each test launch. Follow that forward to the most dramatic possible version of this otherwise scenario: a Soviet lunar landing succeeding at roughly the same time as, or even before, Apollo 11. The propaganda impact would have been enormous. The Soviet Union had already claimed the first satellite, the first human in orbit, and the first spacewalk. A Soviet moon landing added to that streak would have represented an unbroken run of the most significant milestones in the entire space race, directly undermining the specific message the American Apollo program was built to send: proof that American technology, and, by extension, its entire economic and political system, could outproduce and out-innovate its Cold War rival on the largest possible stage. That propaganda shift ripples outward in ways far beyond just Cold War bragging rights. Much of the competition between the United States and Soviet Union during this era played out through influence over non-aligned nations, deciding which economic and political model looked more capable of delivering results. Newly independent countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were actively courted by both superpowers throughout the 1960s, often through infrastructure investment, military aid, and cultural diplomacy specifically designed to demonstrate which system represented the future worth aligning with. A continued, unbroken Soviet lead in space achievement could plausibly have strengthened the Soviet Union's standing and influence across parts of the developing world still weighing which superpower system looked more capable, potentially shifting the outcome of proxy conflicts and alliance decisions that were already being fought out, sometimes literally, across those same regions during this period. It also changes the shape of the American response. In our actual history, once the United States won the race to the moon, public and political interest in space spending declined fairly quickly, and the Apollo program itself was cut short, with planned later missions canceled and no serious follow-through toward Mars or a permanent lunar presence for decades afterward. Congress had already begun trimming NASA's budget even before Apollo 11 flew, and once the symbolic goal was achieved, the political incentive to keep funding an expensive program largely evaporated. If the Soviet Union had reached the moon first instead, the pressure on the United States to respond may have worked in the opposite direction, not winding down after a symbolic victory, but escalating further, potentially accelerating funding toward a Mars mission, a permanent lunar base, or other ambitious follow-up programs specifically to reclaim the technological high ground, rather than simply declare victory and move on. It's not hard to imagine an American public and Congress far less willing to cut NASA's budget in the early 1970s if the story being told wasn't "we won the race," but rather, "we're still behind and need to catch up." The entire shape of American spaceflight for the following decades, including whether the space shuttle program ever exists in the same form, or whether resources instead get redirected toward a more ambitious deep space program, could plausibly look completely different. There's a domestic angle inside the Soviet Union worth considering too. Continued high-profile success in space provided real, tangible legitimacy for the Soviet government during a period when economic performance at home was becoming an increasingly difficult story to tell convincingly. Soviet citizens faced chronic shortages of consumer goods and housing throughout this era, and the government relied heavily on scientific and military achievements to demonstrate the system's underlying strength despite those everyday struggles. A successful, continued string of space firsts, capped by a moon landing, could plausibly have extended that source of domestic political capital further into the 1970s, potentially altering how much slack Soviet leadership had to work with heading into a decade that, in our actual history, saw the beginning of the economic stagnation that eventually contributed to the Soviet Union's collapse roughly 2 decades later. It's worth being careful not to overstate this, though. A single symbolic victory almost certainly wouldn't have single-handedly prevented the deeper structural economic problems that eventually caught up with the Soviet system regardless. But historians studying the relationship between prestige projects and public confidence in authoritarian and one-party systems generally agree that these kinds of achievements buy real, if temporary, political room to maneuver, and a few extra years of that room, arriving at a genuinely pivotal moment in Soviet economic history, could have shifted the timeline of internal reform pressures, leadership transitions, or even the specific years in which the eventual collapse unfolded. There's also a harder-edged technical thread running underneath all of this civilian achievement. The same rocket engineering that powered Korolev's spacecraft was directly tied to Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile development, since the two programs shared engineers, facilities, and fundamental propulsion technology throughout the Cold War. A more successful, better resourced N-1 program under a still-living Korolev doesn't just mean a flashier space achievement. It plausibly means faster iteration and refinement on heavy-lift rocket technology with direct military applications at a moment when both superpowers were racing to build ever larger and more accurate nuclear delivery systems. The line between peaceful space exploration and weapons development was always thinner than the public messaging on either side like to admit, and a stronger Soviet space program likely means a somewhat different pace to that darker, parallel arms race running alongside it. And then there's the question of what actually happens to the Soviet cosmonauts themselves in this otherwise scenario. Alexei Leonov already carried the weight of being first to walk in space. Landing on the moon as well would have made him arguably the single most decorated and internationally recognized individual to emerge from the entire Cold War space competition on either side. That level of global fame in a system that carefully managed how much individual recognition any citizen received relative to the state would have created its own unique political complications for Soviet leadership to navigate, managing a national hero whose fame potentially rivaled the government's own claimed achievements. So maybe the strangest part of this whole otherwise scenario isn't the rocket, or the moon landing itself, or even the propaganda war it might have reshaped. It's the fact that so much of it plausibly hinges on which surgeon happened to be assigned to one operation, on one specific day, treating a man most of the public wasn't even allowed to know existed. Korolev spent his career hidden behind a classified title, specifically to protect the Soviet space program from losing him to an assassin or a foreign intelligence operation. In the end, the actual threat came from something far more mundane than any Cold War plot, an ordinary surgical complication, treated by someone who wasn't the specialist the situation actually called for. There's a quiet irony in that worth sitting with. An entire security apparatus existed to shield this one man from the kind of dramatic, deliberate threat every Cold War thriller trains you to expect: foreign agents, sabotage, defection pressure. None of it mattered in the end. The actual point of failure was bureaucratic and mundane, a hospital assignment made for political convenience rather than medical necessity, on a day that turned out to matter far more than anyone in that operating room could have possibly understood at the time. If the entire trajectory of the most technologically visible competition of the Cold War may have hinged on which doctor happened to be in the room that day, it raises an unsettling question worth sitting with. How many other defining global rivalries we assume were decided by ideology, funding, or raw capability actually came down to something as small and as human as one person's access to the right medical care at the right moment. That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the leaders whose deaths quietly decided wars they never lived to see the end of. Subscribe and find out who else never got the chance to finish what they started.